One of the key developments of the 1920s was the growth of American industry, particularly those industries that produced goods for consumers. Goods such as food, uh, household appliances, consumable goods, things we bought and bought in large numbers. Industries that produce these goods will be key to our economy beginning in the 1920s as we embrace the idea of consumerism in this country as an economic staple of our system, economic system. The idea of consumerism that companies and businesses produce goods and we as consumers buy those goods and then they produce more goods and we buy more goods and over and over again. The idea is that the more they produce, the more we consume, and this helps the economy. Included among these goods were household appliances like vacuums and stoves and irons, things that were now powered by electricity and designed to provide more convenience, to get work done faster, but the idea that if these are done faster, if these household chores are done faster, especially for women, then they have more time to do other things. They have more free time in their lives. And to an extent, this was true. An electric iron made ironing faster, made ironing easier. And so a woman who was charged with this would have had more free time technically. But the converse of that, the other side of that, was that, well, now that ironing is easy, you do it more often because your husband, your family expects clean clothes and iron shirts all the time. So while it may have been easier to use an iron, it also meant that because of that ease of use, you would be using it more often. But Americans bought these goods and they bought them in mass. They were buying lots and lots of these new appliances and new goods in other areas as well, particularly automobiles. Cars became a very important element, important product that we bought in this country during the 1920s. None more important probably than the Ford Model T, which kind of set the bar for American consumption when it came to automobiles during this period. Now, the Model T was not a new invention in the 1920s. It had been around for a while at this point, the first being produced in 1908. But the problem with Ford and his Model T up to this point had been that it was too expensive. It cost too much money to buy because of the way it was produced. So what revolutionizes not just the Model T and Ford itself and the car industry, but production as a whole in this country was the use of Ford's new ideas in mass production, the use of the assembly line especially. The idea from Ford's point of view was that the old way of building a car, or anything for that matter, had been to move the man to the station that he needed to work in order to build that part for the car. Ford's idea now was that instead of moving the man to the work, we move the work to the man, meaning you put the car on the assembly line and you have people on the assembly line who have a specific job to do in the assembly line process. So when the car comes to you, your job might be to put the tires on the car, or to add the steering wheel, or add doors, or what have you. And so the idea of that was that each man had a specific job to do, and the car would roll across the assembly line while you did your specific function. Now what this did was that it made production faster. It allowed you to produce more cars in a shorter amount of time, and it would eventually lower the cost of Model Ts to the point where by the 1920s, so many Model Ts were being produced. In fact, the stat is in 1914, Ford produced 300 Model Ts, but by 1923, it could produce 2 million per year. In fact, by the mid to late 1920s, Ford was producing one new Model T every 24 seconds. So you see the efficiency of the assembly line process that Ford introduces, and other companies and making other products will follow Ford's example. The mass production of these products makes them less expensive. And so more and more people are buying automobiles. More and more people are buying eventually refrigerators and stoves and other things like that. And so we see mass production kicking off thanks to things like the assembly line, pioneered to a certain degree by Ford. And Ford wasn't the only automobile company changing how we bought things. If you look at General Motors and what they did during this period, GM said, well, why pay for a car fully up front? Cars are expensive. What we need to do instead is offer people to buy their cars, our cars, on installment plans. So GM, around the same time in 1919 or so, as Ford really kicks off, GM offers monthly installments for people who buy GM cars. The idea being that you don't have to sell or pay a lot of money up front to buy your car, but instead you can spend money over time in a monthly payment to pay off your debt. Now, what this does is that it makes cars more affordable for everyday people. You don't have, $600 to buy a car, but you can pay $40 a month to own that car. And the other aspect of this idea of monthly payments is that now you're more inclined to buy a car more often because you can pay for it monthly. Once you pay for that car, maybe you want to upgrade to the new model that's coming out. Maybe the new model has better headlights or better brakes or something like that, something that your car does not have. And the incentive is, since you're not paying for all the car up front, you can just keep paying monthly payments on the new car. So you're helping GM by buying their newest product, but you're also helping yourself because you're getting the latest version of that product. So we see that a lot in the consumer society of the 1920s. And even today, we still have that same issue, right? The idea of needing the newest cell phone. That's not that much different, but it's just enough different for you to want it, and yet you're not really paying more. You just keep paying your monthly plan or whatever in order to get that new phone. So the idea of what we buy and how we pay for it really comes from this period of the 1920s and is with us even today. Now, another aspect of this consumption is that we have to be incentivized to want to buy new things. It's not just that General Motors is putting out a new car, it's that we have to be told about it. And we have to be kind of sold on the idea of buying this new car. And that's where the concept of advertising and marketing really comes in during the 1920s. Now, we're kind of used to advertising, we're used to marketing today, and there had been that advertising element in our society well before the beginning of the 1920s. But what changes is the methods and the delivery of advertising during this period. So, to understand this new method of advertising and how it's going to be a little bit different, we have to go back several years in the story to talk about World War I, particularly how the American government used propaganda to sell Americans on the idea to support the war during that period. And the government used an agency called the Committee on Public Information to kind of explain to Americans, to tell them why the country was going to war and to keep them supportive of the war effort. Now, in order to do that, the CPI, as it was called, used a lot of emotional appeals designed to entice you or to encourage you to support the war by playing on your fears, by playing on your emotions. The idea of fear, the idea of anger, the idea of being left out. These were all tactics used by the CPI in an effort to get people motivated to support the war. You don't want to not support the war because you'd be seen as different or unpatriotic, and you didn't want to be one of those people. You wanted to be one of the ones with the group. We would use fear to scare you into supporting the war. You could be next. If the Germans win in France, who knows, we could be next. Or you can use hate, the idea that we can win the war, and we have to win the war because the Germans are doing bad things to people in Europe. Or we can use sympathy, or the fear of guilt or embarrassment. Hey, support the troops in the front. You're not up there fighting with them, but you can do your part back at home. So the idea was using emotions to help support the war effort. Well, once the war is over, these guys, these CPI staff and employees, the people designing and making all this propaganda, are going to go out into the world in the United States, and they're going to form, a lot of them anyway, are going to form advertising companies and marketing companies. And they're going to use what they learned and employed in the war for selling goods in this country. They're going to work with big businesses, corporations like Ford and General Motors and other organizations. They're going to use those ideas to help those companies sell their products. So what we see is really the growth and use of modern advertising techniques during the 1920s. Advertisers are going to appeal to your emotions in order to get you to buy something, especially the emotion of feeling left out. You don't want to not buy this new car because everybody else is buying it, so you need to buy it as well. You don't want to not buy our mouthwash because people with bad breath don't get dates. They don't meet men. and so on and so forth. The idea was, again, to appeal to people's emotions, to sell them on the idea of the good life, that your life can be better if you buy these products that we're promoting. All you have to do is just spend your money and buy that new car, buy that refrigerator, and so on and so forth. You want to meet the perfect man? Buy this kind of makeup, and you will. One of the most important demographics during this period for advertisers and for corporations were women. Women were making up more and more of the consumer base in this country during this period. They were the ones buying the food and the goods for their homes. They were the ones buying makeup and other products for themselves. And so women became a larger, increasingly larger target for advertising during this period. One of the more interesting efforts to sell goods to women during this period involved the use of cigarettes. Cigarettes were extremely popular in the United States, but women didn't really smoke during this period, or at least up until this period. Smoking was seen as something that was traditionally a man's thing. Women who smoked were considered to be kind of immoral or have loose morals. And so cigarettes and women weren't really a product, a target for advertisers. But that's going to change in the 1920s whenever a American cigarette company called the American Tobacco Company hires the marketing group headed by a man named Edward Bernays, who had served on the CPI and is kind of the father of advertising and propaganda in this country. And they're going to use Bernays in order to sell cigarettes to a market that's not really been tapped yet, and that is the market of women. And so how is Bernays going to do this? Well, he's going to promote cigarettes as a sign of individualism, as a sign of women's freedom, in a time period whenever women were becoming more and more self-reliant. And so he used cigarettes as kind of to go along with that, hand in hand with that newfound freedom, sexual freedom, freedom from men, and freedom to do what they pleased on their own. And now he tried to incorporate cigarettes into that lifestyle. One of the things he did was kind of a guerrilla campaign where he had women form up and march in an Easter parade in New York, and they were smoking while they marched. And he dubbed them, the cigarettes they were smoking, as freedom torches, meaning that these women were carrying torches of freedom while they marched in the Easter Day parade in New York. By smoking these cigarettes, they were expressing their individuality, their freedom, their sexual freedom, their equality with men. And so cigarettes became associated with women as a way to express the freedom of your gender in a time whenever that wasn't always allowed. And so cigarettes became very popular amongst women, and the American Tobacco Company and other cigarette manufacturers would begin to make a lot of profit on women smokers as women began to buy into that idea of freedom and individuality and buying cigarettes as their numbers increased in that area. Something like the numbers are in 1923, like 5% of all women smoked, and by the time we get into the 1930s, that number is almost tripled. So you see the power and influence of marketing in order to benefit American manufacturers. At the same time during this period, you also see American manufacturers and companies begin to try branding their products, creating brand names and brand name icons designed to appeal to consumers, to shoppers, as they have these large selections of food and goods to choose from. The idea was that the brand name represented something that people were familiar with, and if they knew the brand name and saw the brand name, they'd buy it again. The same went for stores and shops that were chains like White Castle or Walgreens, which were some of these early attempts to create chain stores. People knew that whenever they walked into a Walgreens in a certain state or a certain county in a certain state, or walked into a Walgreens in another city or county or state, that they were going to basically get the exact same thing. And that whenever they bought a can of Campbell's soup in Seattle, Washington, it's going to taste just like the same can of Campbell's soup in Portland, Maine. And so the idea of brand names and buying brand names and shopping and eating at chains became much more common during this period. The idea again being to make people comfortable and make things familiar for them as they shop. Now, the downside of this, the negative aspect of this, is that by creating brand names and creating mass-produced goods and creating chain stores, was that a lot of the individuality of states and locations were kind of lost in the process. And so what you see, thanks to mass consumption like this and advertising in such large mass quantities, is that people begin to kind of buy the same clothes, eat the same food, and some of those regionalities and some of those subtle differences in what we eat and wear and so on and so forth kind of fall by the wayside during this period. And finally, one more important aspect to the consumerism and consumer society of the 1920s was how people received these advertisements and how we learned about new goods and were encouraged to buy new goods. And that was the result not just of the old traditional way of advertising through magazines and newspapers, but also thanks to the idea of mass advertising that came with the introduction and popularity of radio. Radio becomes a huge phenomenon during the 1920s. Radio broadcast and listening to radio broadcasts became part of our everyday lives during this period. Much like watching television or going online is now, people flocked to radios to listen to the newest show, sports, political news, whatever they could find or listen to, they would listen to it. And radio is a powerful medium to get messages out, not just to tell stories or to tell the news, but also to get messages out, especially when it comes to advertising. It's a great way to have one message reach a mass of people over a long range during this time period. And so advertisers really caught on to the idea of using the radio to try and sell their products to large amounts of people with one single message. And radio companies and stations needed this. They had a lot of free airtime, a lot of quiet time. And the last thing you want to do is have quiet time on a radio broadcast because people might change the channel to find something else. And so to fill that time, you would include advertisements to keep people at least listening until the next program began. And of course, advertisers paid to put their advertisements on the radio, so radio companies are making money off this also. So you see the growth of the popularity of the radio in terms of a way to reach mass audiences in the United States during this period. And in that same process of reaching mass audiences with news and stories and sports, you're also reaching mass audiences with advertisement designed to compel them and convince them to buy more and more goods. Another important element of the 1920s is the role of women and what was happening to women in the United States during this decade. It's during this period that we see how women are viewing themselves and how they're viewing their role in society and how that's going to be changing during this period. And so the 1920s is really sort of the beginning of a new wave of feminism in the United States, an effort to, by many women, reject the notions or the preconceived notions of what a woman was and what her role was in society, especially as a wife and a mother. As the 1920s begin, women have just received the right to vote after a long and arduous battle to gain that right. And so women now have received some political equality with men in this country. At least white women and white men have. And so that ushers in a new era to a certain degree of how women kind of see themselves in their roles. And as they begin to exercise their political rights, you see them also beginning to exercise more of their social rights within the country. Now, for some time, women had been going beyond the traditional role of mother and wife and working at home, although that was still kind of the idealized version of a woman, the wife who stayed home and took care of the family. But during the industrialization of this country, more and more women were finding themselves looking for work in factories outside of the home or looking for jobs as counter girls in department stores. And while much of this was due to the fact that women needed jobs to support their families, especially women at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder, a lot of these were middle-class women who were going out to find work to earn money, their own money, independently of any man. Their idea, though, was that they would go earn money for a while as a young woman And then as they work, they'd meet a man and then become a wife after that. So even in that environment, they're practicing their independence to a certain degree, but the ultimate goal, though, for many, to find a man and settle down and become that traditional wife. That wasn't the case for more impoverished women who didn't have that luxury. They had to work and keep working to support their families. But as the economy grows after World War I and we get to the 1920s, you see more and more women and people in general with disposable income. And because of that, more opportunities exist for people to go out and have a good time. This is why this is called the 1920s and sometimes called the Roaring Twenties. And women took part in that, especially younger women. Younger women would exercise a more carefree lifestyle. Some say this is because of all the frustration and anxiety of the cataclysmic war that had just existed and taken place prior to the 1920s. But because of that psychological anxiety, people were a little more open, a little more free, and women were taking advantage of that. And so women, again, exercising their individuality and advocating the fact that they're equal to men, are going to see men going out and having a good time and enjoying themselves, and they're going to say, well, why can't we do that also? And so you'll see a number of women, younger women especially, kind of embrace that kind of like lifestyle of enjoying themselves, kind of a carefree lifestyle. And this is the rise of what becomes known as the flapper in American and also European society. The flapper was a young woman, usually in her late teens, early 20s, who dressed a certain style that did not resemble the styles that came before. Gone were corsets and things of that nature. And now in vogue were more slender dresses with lower hemlines or higher hemlines. Hairstyles that were more bobbed and short to look more male than the traditional long hair of a woman. And makeup. Flappers would go out, they would smoke, they would drink, they would listen to music, they would pal around with men, not to meet them as husbands, but to have them as friends. And again, eventually the idea is to meet a husband, but as young women, these flappers were enjoying themselves in kind of what some critics saw as a hedonistic lifestyle that was meant to separate them from the more traditional expectations of what womanhood was in America. And so the flappers were sometimes seen as kind of a threat to the traditional American family. And their activities were seen as being sort of, again, a threat and a danger to American society. Now, not every woman who was in her 20s was a flapper. In fact, what you see is that because of the rise of marketing and advertising and the popularity of movies that promote the idea and styles of flappers, that a lot of women are going to embrace the clothing and some of the aspects of being a flapper without practicing the sort of activities a flapper typically would. So women were a huge marketing block for advertisers. And since those styles were so popular, advertisers marketed to women to wear those styles and to wear makeup and to embrace those kinds of haircuts and things like that in order for businesses to make money. But within that flapper lifestyle and outside of that flapper lifestyle, you do also see efforts by women to exercise more political and social authority in their own lives. One of the biggest issues of the time period was the issue of birth control and contraception, which is advocated by women such as Margaret Sanger. Sanger believed that women had a right to discuss and to have access to contraception for birth control in order to control the number of children that they had. And the issue here in 1920s America was that discussion of and even possession of birth control was illegal, thanks to the 1870s law called the Comstock Act. But Sanger was advocating for birth control, and others were advocating for birth control in this environment, as both a way to limit the number of unwanted pregnancies in the country, which was seen by many as a problem, and also as a way for women to enjoy sex as more than just a procreational activity. A lot of the thinking of the time period emphasized by people like Sigmund Freud was that men and women should be able to enjoy the act of sex without it leading to procreation. And so, of course, contraception played a large part in that idea. So with more and more women entering the workforce, even though there's still stereotyped to certain roles specifically for women, like nurses and clerks and sales counter women and that sort of thing. More and more young women, especially, exercising their individuality and expressing themselves, and women advocating for rights specifically for their gender on issues that are important to them. We do see a rise in feminism during this period. And although a lot of this new feminist idealism and advocacy will fall away after World War II, especially as women are encouraged to abandon the ideas of being a working woman, and embrace the ideas once more of the more traditional role of a wife and mother in American society. Their traditional roles as seen as housewives and mothers in the 1940s and 1950s, this burst in the 1920s will help set the stage for a renewed feminist uprising, I guess you would call it, in the 1960s and the 1970s.